Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion with the lessons from the accountability mechanism stakeholder of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. It's nice to see so many colleagues joining and showing interest in the accountability mechanisms issue, and a warm welcome, and again, to new colleagues and those of you joining for the first time, a very good day to you all. My name is Azim Manji. I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 10th thematic consultation topic or theme so far. And this is the 5th and final in our series of consultations and discussions on the accountability mechanisms. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Safeguards Division in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB, but also by Mr. Warren Evans, who is the Special Project Facilitator in the Office of the Special Project Facilitator. We are also joined by Ms. Alicia Bebet-Gozun, the Chair of the Compliance Review Panel. As I mentioned, this is our last session for the lessons from the accountability mechanism consultations. This consultation is with government stakeholders in East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific regions, where we have received 76 registration. 51 of these are from outside the ADB network, and 27% or 14 participants are from Mongolia specifically. Today, we are also joined by those outside of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, including India, Pakistan, and the United States. But we are joined from a diverse range of countries within East, Southeast, and the Pacific, including Australia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, Fiji, Indonesia, Japan, Kiribati, Lao People's Democratic Republic, I mentioned Mongolia already, NARO, the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, Thailand, Timor, and Vietnam. In this consultation, the Office of the Special Project Facilitator, as well as the Compliance Review Panel of the ADB, will present their main feedback issues received and the relationship of these comments and feedback of relevance to the Safeguard Policy Update. Just a reminder, the discussion today is directed specifically on the Safeguards Policy and Update process. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy. We also hope to get some proposals and recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future revised policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, and as you've clicked on joining the meeting, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about the recording or distribution of this meeting, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please join us from a quiet and distraction-free area. And a reminder that I can still hear some microphones now, So please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand. You will then be asked to unmute and turn on your cameras so you can ask your question live. Just a reminder to those participants who have their microphones on to please mute yourself, or if I can ask the session moderators or administrators and hosts as well as co-hosts to mute those microphones. A reminder, as we're all colleagues here, to please be respectful to everyone, as well as the time that we try and adhere to. IT support will be provided throughout this session. If you experience technical difficulties or issues, please use the support function for IT by typing your question, query, or issue into the chat box. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few simple guidance issues and questions and notes when using the important buttons. Today, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Lao, Vietnamese, Chinese, Bahasa Indonesia, and Khmer. To access these simultaneous interpretations features, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select the preferred language. When selecting any of these languages and to hear your simultaneous interpreter clearer, please also remember to select the Mute Original Audio button. For those of you listening in Lao, Vietnamese, Chinese, Bahasa, and Khmer, if you feel the simultaneous interpretation is too fast or even possibly too slow, and the interpreter is struggling to match the pace of the English speaker, you can ask the original speaker to slow down or speed up by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on Reactions. When you've clicked on the Reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you can then press the Slow Down button, which is the two reverse arrows in white, or possibly the Speed Up button, which is the two fast forward arrows in blue. This will let the English speakers know to speed up or slow down accordingly so that the translators and interpreters can keep pace. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on the Zoom screen, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. On the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Then click on the Rename button. When you've clicked on Rename, type in your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send us a message, ask a question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the Reactions button again at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click on the Raise Hand icon. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. And then when asked to do so, to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders assembled today, so let me please restate ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. We encourage all stakeholders to articulate your inputs and concerns during this consultation. As I've already mentioned, these will be recorded, documented, and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and/or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address that's being shared in the chat box now. All types of feedback are welcome. These will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination. If you have any issues or concerns on recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through the safeguardsupdate@adb.org email address that's being flashed in the chat box now. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours. Here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. First, Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, we'll be joined by Mr. Warren Evans, the Special Project Facilitator in the Office of the Special Project Facilitator, who will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of complaints received by his office. Thirdly, we will have Elicia Bebet-Gozun, the chair of the Compliance Review Panel, who will elaborate on these as well as explain the differences between the work of the Office of the Special Project Facilitator and her office, the Compliance Review Panel. After these first two presentations by Warren and Bebet, we will have a brief 5-minute break. Following this break, we will have a moderated discussion as facilitated by Ms. Iram Asan. Iram is an advisor who works with the Office of the Compliance Review Panel. This will be a Q&A session that runs for more or less about 75 minutes. And a reminder that you may ask your questions and share experiences in the chat box in English, Lao, Vietnamese, Chinese, Bahasa, and Khmer. You can also raise your questions and share experiences through raising your hand as previously explained. Ms. Asan will prompt you with guide questions to frame the conversation. We'll then have a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and the next steps following the consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim. Good day, welcome, and thank you to all of the participants joining today. It's my great pleasure to open this regional consultation on lessons learned from ADB's accountability mechanism. As Azim has mentioned, this is the 10th regional consultation topic that we have held so far as part of ADB's update of the 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short. I'm really pleased to see many of you joining us again, and thank you for your time and coming back to join another consultation today. For those of you that are not joining, for those of you that are joining for the first time though, let me just provide a very brief summary on the approach that we're taking. ADB launched the update of the SPS in August 2020, following an evaluation of the effectiveness of the SPS by ADB's independent evaluation department. And that study recommended that ADB should update and modernize the policy while also strengthening our own internal institutional arrangements to manage safeguards better, and also developing guidance for our borrowers and clients and supporting the overall program with additional capacity, support, and skills development. The update process is expected to be implemented over about a 2.5-year process, with the new policy expected for consideration by ADB's board by about March 2023, so about a year away from now. These regional consultations are actually a very important part of the process. We at ADB are in listening mode, and we're also preparing for these through analytical studies, and these will feed into the development of the policy itself. Now, today's session on lessons learned from the accountability mechanism is actually one of the really critical topics and a great opportunity for us to learn about experiences from past projects that have had challenges, particularly those projects where we have received complaints from affected people that have been elevated to the accountability mechanism. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the mechanism, I'll just provide a very brief introduction. And then in a few moments, my colleagues will be presenting some more details and also a short video for you. Now, the mechanism was first established in 2003, and it was then updated in 2012. So the current policy is from 2012. And it's designed to provide an independent, transparent, and responsive forum for people that are affected by ADB-assisted projects to voice their concern. It's not, however, the first place of call. Where people have grievances or concerns, those really should be addressed at the project level. And that's, of course, the quickest way for them to resolve issues and the most streamlined approach for a project to be able to continue with its development and to reach its development goals. Processes like grievance redress mechanisms are obviously a critical part of that process. And the mechanism itself requires that good faith efforts are implemented by parties seeking support from the accountability mechanism. Now, the mechanism is designed to ensure compliance with ADB's operational policies and procedures, including, importantly, our safeguards, during both the design, processing, and implementation of the projects. And it should provide an independent, transparent, and responsive forum for anyone to raise their concerns. There are two windows under which people can seek support through the mechanism. The first is a problem-solving function, which is led by the Special Project Facilitator. And we have Mr. Warren Evans here representing that office today. And then we also have a compliance review function, which looks at whether or not ADB has complied with its own policies. And this is implemented by an independent compliance review panel. And today we have the chair of that panel, Ms. Babette Gaurzon. Now, from the perspective of preparing the new safeguard policy, of course, any cases where we have had challenges in implementing safeguards or perhaps situations where we've not been able to comply with the safeguards are important. They give us an opportunity to look at whether there are changes that need to be made to the policy, maybe clarifications, maybe additional language in the policy, or areas that we may need to look at in terms of supporting and strengthening implementation. For example, good practices with grievance redress mechanisms. So looking at these lessons today is very important. And I think you've also got some of your own experiences that will be able to contribute to this process. We know that where we receive complaints to the accountability mechanism, that there's typically been some implementation challenges for which people have not been able to satisfactorily resolve their concerns at the project level through the grievance redress mechanisms or through consultations with project implementing and executing agencies. And of course, this can be for a range of reasons. And this is something that we're going to be discussing and presenting on today. Of course, when these issues occur, can be a great challenge to people affected themselves, but also for the project itself, causing significant delays with project implementation. Could also be possible cost implications or cost overruns. And these are, of course, things that we would like to avoid. The faster and easier that we can address concerns by affected people, of course, the better it is for a project. So, during this session, in a moment, we're going to have some presentation by my colleagues in the accountability mechanism. They'll be presenting the lessons that they have gathered through the more than 200 projects that ADB has had to the accountability mechanism since it was established. And then we'd like to have an opportunity to hear from you with your own experiences. Some of the same projects you may have been involved in and had your own experiences and perspectives on, and that's very important for us to hear. So, looking forward to really having an open discussion today, hearing your perspectives. You may have questions and clarifications on the accountability mechanism, and you might like to give us some recommendations for things that we should consider for the new policy. So looking forward to the session, and thank you once again for joining. Now, let me now hand over to Mr. Warren Evans, the Special Project Facilitator, who is going to start us with the presentation and video. Over to you, Warren. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are. I'm going to kick this off with a short video that sort of summarizes the accountability mechanism before getting into a few slides on some of the experience that we have and lessons learned. So could you go ahead and show the video, please?
The Asian Development Bank is dedicated to reduce poverty in Asia and the Pacific and promote social and economic development through loans, grants, technical assistance, and equity investments. Through its products and services, ADB expects to contribute significantly to sustainable and inclusive development in Asia and the Pacific. As such, ADB works to ensure compliance with ADB's operational policies and procedures during the design, processing, and implementation of ADB-assisted projects. These policies provide social and environmental safeguards against involuntary resettlement, environmental degradation, and such other adverse effects that may be the unintended results of development projects. ADB strives to ensure that the projects it finances will not result in any direct and material harm to people. Audit, supervision, quality control, and evaluation systems are employed to prevent and address most issues that occur in planning and implementation. However, despite all preventive measures, there are instances where complaints may be raised by people affected by a project. To address these concerns, a project-level grievance redress mechanism is in place on all ADB-assisted projects as the primary venue by which complainants may seek relief. Complaints may also be brought to the attention of ADB's operations departments, which address concerns through problem-solving and compliance efforts. In addition, ADB instituted an accountability mechanism with a compliance review function as a platform of last resort to seek redress. ADB's accountability mechanism provides an independent, transparent, and responsive forum by which project-affected people may seek redress when directly and materially harmed or likely to be harmed by an ADB-assisted project. ADB's accountability mechanism has two functions: problem-solving and compliance review. Problem-solving, conducted by the Special Project Facilitator, uses non-formal, flexible, and consensus-based approaches to resolve a complaint. In contrast, a compliance review may be requested only when the probable cause of harm can be attributed to non-compliance by ADB with its operational policies and procedures. The alleged non-compliance by ADB is investigated by the Compliance Review Panel, a fact-finding body on behalf of the ADB Board of Directors. A compliance review does not investigate a borrowing country and its executing or implementing agencies or a private sector client. Rather, compliance review is a corrective measure aimed to address issues that may ensue from non-compliance with ADB's operational policies and procedures in ADB-assisted projects. With the active participation of all stakeholders, the accountability mechanism becomes an instrument to institute improvements within ADB systems, from lessons learned into compliance review to enable ADB to work more effectively towards sustainable and inclusive development.
Thank you. So that gives you a bit of background. There are just two other points I'll add to the background on the accountability mechanism that don't come out in the video. One is that ADB is a little bit different than most multilateral development banks. I think all the multilateral development banks now have both a dispute resolution or problem-solving function, essentially the same thing. and a compliance review function. All the other MDBs, almost all the other MDBs, both of those functions report to the board. Whereas in ADB, Babette, who you'll meet in a little while, as chair of the compliance review panel, and the compliance review panel in her office report directly to the board. But as a special project facilitator, I report directly to the president of ADB. Now, both of us are independent and neutral. And so the reporting function doesn't affect that independence and neutrality. So I wanted to just point out a few of the key reasons that we receive complaints to the accountability mechanism. Most of the complaints that we've received in the last few years relate to improper resettlement or complaints about land acquisition, resettlement, and compensation. Virtually every complaint that we get also refers to inadequate consultation and information disclosure. Every one of them. I can't recall a single complaint that's come in where this was not part of the complaint from the project affected people. Most of the environmental issues that have been raised in the recent past relate to noise and vibration issues, either during construction or during operation. So it may be a highway project, it may be construction of any kind of a facility, but most of them relate to noise and vibration issues. And then finally, many of the cases that we receive also point out that there were inadequate baseline studies conducted during project preparation. These may be environmental studies, socioeconomic surveys, better recognition of the project affected people, et cetera. So inadequate baseline studies has been pointed out in many of the complaints we receive. Next slide, please. We have had a fairly dramatic increase in the number of complaints over the last few years. Most of the complainants that file complaints to the accountability mechanism, they have, as I'll mention, as I think was mentioned in the earlier discussion, they have a choice of picking either compliance review or problem solving. And most of them select problem solving as the function of choice. One thing to point out is that if a complainant selects problem solving and they're not satisfied with the process, with the progress of resolving the issues, then they have the right to withdraw from that process and file a compliance review. If they file a compliance review at the outset, they do not have the option of coming back and filing for withdrawing from that process and filing a request for problem solving. So the increase in the number of complaints over the last few years, we've identified a few reasons, but I think the number one reason is that shortly after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, ADB approved in 2011, 2012, 2013, ADB approved a number of fairly large, complex infrastructure projects. Many of these are linear infrastructure projects, transmission lines, highways, and so on, energy projects, and so on. Those projects, it takes a while for them to actually start construction, and they are now under construction and under implementation. And it's at that point where people become more aware of the impacts on them. And so there is a time lag between board approval and filing of complaints on projects. So I think that's the main reason we've seen an increase over the last few years of complaints. Next slide, please. So the one point I want to make on this slide is if you look at the last year, 2021, there are a number of complaints filed which are ineligible. This raises eyebrows often, and understandably so. The reason for the ineligibility is simply because a part of the accountability mechanism policy, a key hurdle for eligibility is that the complainant needs to have attempted to resolve the issues with the operational department of ADB, not with the executing agency, but with the operational department. And if they haven't done that, then by definition, the complaint is ineligible. So for example, in 2021, of the 17 complaints filed to the accountability mechanism, 14 of them did not meet that criteria. Now, that doesn't mean that we just throw it back. In fact, what we do, whether the complaint goes to the compliance review function or to the problem-solving function, we have a meeting with the project, with the complainants as well as the project operational department, and we reach an agreement with the operational department on what steps should be taken to help resolve this issue and avoid it coming to the accountability mechanism. Excuse me. So we reach an agreement on what steps should be taken, and then we monitor the implementation of that agreement. So in most of these cases that are ineligible, the issues do get resolved without us having to be in the middle of it. Now, in cases where the complainants are not satisfied with the efforts of the operational department working with the executing agency or implementing agency to resolve the issues, then they have the right to come back to us and refile the complaint, request a reconsideration of the complaint. That has happened a few times over the last few years, but not very often. Usually it does get resolved at the project level. Next slide, please. So we do have quite a bit of experience. Most of that, quite frankly, has been accumulated over the last few years because of the increase in complaints. And so we put a lot of effort into really analyzing what worked, what didn't work, worked and didn't work, and what should be done in the future to improve our operations. Next slide, please. So just a few of the lessons, key lessons learned and recommendations. Excuse me. I'm in Nepal and the air was quite dusty yesterday. I've got a little frog in my throat, sorry. Number one is to increase the number of consultations. And this is the key. This is the key. In project preparation, during project implementation, we need to really focus more on effective consultations with affected people, and in particular, highlighting their option to go to a grievance redress mechanism, how they do that, their option of going to the accountability mechanism if they wish to do so. So much better consultations. This is the key for improving, reducing the number of complaints that get to both the operational department and the accountability mechanism. With the resolution process, we found that it's much more effective if there is a delegated authority at the lowest level, the contractor or the local government, to deal with most of the issues, instead of the affected people having to go to a higher level of government or to ADB. If they have direct access at the local level to organizations that have the authority to resolve the issues, it's much more effective. In regards to both of these, we need a much better approach to social mobilization. And we're increasingly using community liaison experts, particularly for complex projects, to enhance the project and GRM awareness. So people are aware of what their options are. In this regard, we need better communications, whether it's manuals or videos that are made accessible to project affected people so they know what the process is to file their grievance. Next slide, please. Some of the lessons learned in particular on grievance redress mechanisms is, number one, if there is an effective process at the local level, if the local government already has a process where people can come to them and complain about water supply or drainage or electricity, any municipal services or local government services, if that's working well, then we should build on that for the grievance redress mechanism for the ADB finance project. Now, if that's not working well, or there isn't such a process, then we will have to develop a GRM specific for that project. We find that in many cases where contractors or local government are authorized to deal with issues, there isn't a formal complaint registration and tracking process. And it's very important that this process be formalized. So we support the idea of contractors and local government taking responsibility for resolving issues, but we need to also make sure that there is a formalized process of registering and tracking. In all of these issues, we need much better training. We need better techniques for training staff. We need budgets for staff training. And the training is key, because in most of the cases that we've had, there is a grievance redress mechanism, but it's not working very well. And one of the reasons it's not working well is because it is not something that people have been trained in. So we need to make sure that there is training for these people, that they understand what the process is, they are better at communicating, and so on. And then finally, in those cases where projects are closed or budgets are utilized, but issues come up at a later stage, there needs to be contingency funds for resolving conflicts of unanticipated problems. And this is more than just the standard contingency budget for a project. This is really needs to recognize that those contingency funds may be required for conflict resolution. Next slide, please. So with this, I'd like to invite my colleague Babette to take over and present the rest of our accountability mechanism presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Warren. Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this consultation. So from the many cases that we've handled that requested for compliance review, these are some, we would like to share with you some of the key lessons that we've learned. The first one is really on the importance of establishing comprehensive baseline data. As we all know, this will inform the project planning, the design, as well as the monitoring of the effectiveness of the mitigation measures that have been identified. What we want to highlight here is the importance of a comprehensive pre-project socioeconomic assessment of the conditions of the affected communities. This is the only way that we can adequately determine the impact of the project on them. And then down the line, it will provide us a basis for actually then saying that the lives of the people affected by the ADB project are better off because of the project, or as required by the safeguards policy, at the very least are not worse off. We also, the second key lesson that we've identified, next please, is due diligence. ADB does due diligence of the projects that are submitted for funding. And it is very critical that there is an assessment of the capacity of the borrower to actually implement the ADB safeguards policy. Unless if there are gaps that are found, the necessary interventions to build that capacity must be integrated in the project itself. We saw that major gap in a complaint that we got from Cambodia, and also another one from Sri Lanka. While the limitations of the implementing and executing agencies were identified, there were very inadequate interventions that were put in place. And so problems happened down the line. That also includes an assessment of the gaps between ADB safeguards and the borrowing country's legal framework. There must be continuing dialogue between the project partners to discuss this and settle this, highlighting the importance of implementing safeguards. The possibility of affected persons themselves participating in the entire project cycle should also be explored, so that they can provide their inputs from the very beginning, from the design of the project, all the way to implementation and monitoring this project implementation, so that we would actually have stronger safeguard measures. The third key lesson has to do with having adequate resources on safeguard implementation, monitoring, and all the way to corrective remedial actions. Adequate resources must be allocated for safeguards throughout the project cycle, not just front-loaded during the processing. And this includes the appointment of skilled or designation of skilled technical staff relevant to the coverage, the scope of that project, so that they can actually provide the necessary inputs from the very beginning of the design, planning, and then implementation of the project. They can provide supervision and assistance, and also then towards monitoring. And of course, to maximize the use of these resources, it's very important that we do things right from the very beginning, and that there be more sustainable capacity building measures. The fourth key lesson that we've found is on constructive, meaningful participation of project stakeholders, all the stakeholders, including the affected persons. We know that this is a key requirement, and as Warren mentioned, this comes out in almost all of the cases that we receive, the inadequacy of meaningful consultation. And this, of course, cannot happen if from the very beginning, we do not identify who the affected persons are. If we miss that, then we will not be able to identify the impacts of the project on them and integrate their concerns into the project. We saw this happening in a case in Georgia where the visually impaired were missed, and also in a case in India where the fishermen were also missed. And for a meaningful participation to happen, there must be continuous flow of up-to-date information back and forth. There has to be a feedback mechanism, just one way. And in fact, involving affected persons could actually enhance project design and benefits. And we've seen this in a couple of complaints that we've handled, where, for example, in Georgia, the visually impaired provided inputs, and which government considered, and that led to the installation of traffic lights with audible signals, clearer markings of pedestrian crosswalks, and the installation of speed control measures, which benefited not just themselves, but also everyone else in that particular community. And while there are minimum standards for meaningful consultation, there's actually room to customize this based on what the project needs. Next, please. The next lesson is really on how do we look at compliance review. Compliance review, people have a perception that it's there to blame and shame. It's not. It's actually an instrument of the bank to also contribute to improving its development effectiveness. And the idea of identifying if there's non-compliance that led to harm or likely to lead to harm is to be able to correct that. And based on the lessons that are then learned in the process of correcting it, we can provide necessary inputs so that we can improve how projects are designed, implemented, and monitored. And so instead of looking at the investigation, what should be propagated are the objectives of the compliance review. That's in improving the design, as I mentioned, implementation and monitoring, and also contributing to institutional learning. And while we are an independent body, we are not isolated. After all, we are implementing the policy of the bank and ensuring that the other policies are implemented. So we want to promote it and also undertake it, do it as a collaborative endeavor among the different project partners. That's ADB management, the borrower, the affected communities, NGOs, and other concerned stakeholders in the project area, so that we can optimize project outcomes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Thank you so much for that, Babette. And thank you also, Warren, for providing us with the clarity, the feedback, and the processes of both the compliance review panel and the Office of the Special Project Facilitator, and of course, the differences between what Warren's office does and what Babette's office does. And thank you also to Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. We hope that we can get further feedback from you on what ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas during this facilitated question and answer session. This session that will be coming up after the break will run for about 75 minutes. But as I mentioned, there is some flexibility in that. With that, please allow me to invite you all now to take a brief 5-minute break. But before I do, can I please invite you to think about our poll evaluation that we will have coming up a little bit later on. We want you to think about providing us written feedback on how to improve these consultations, the approaches to the consultations, and the rigor and how we interact with each other. And there's a link that's being posted now in the chat box to menti.com. This link will remain open for about 2 hours after this consultation. So while you're off getting your favorite beverage, drink, tea, coffee, whatever it may be, just a heads up and to start thinking about how specifically these consultations can be improved, and relay us those responses anytime from now until about 2 hours after this consultation. But reminders that Iram Asan will be with us after this break, and she will be facilitating the moderated Q&A session. So with that, you will see that at the top right-hand corner of the slide that is coming up next, there's a countdown timer that will give you an indication of how much time is left in the break. And as the music begins to die off and fade away, you'll know that it's time to return to your screen. So with that, please join us after 5 minutes and enjoy the break. Thank you and see you soon. Welcome back, everybody. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Ms. Iram Asan, who works with the Office of the Compliance Review Panel. Iram will be moderating this session with some guided questions. And once again, a reminder that you can pose your questions live or post your questions in the chat box in Lao, Vietnamese, Chinese, Bahasa, and Khmer. You can also ask your questions in these languages. Iram, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all here in this forum. And just before I start the discussion, wanted to share a few reminders with you, which Azim and other participants have already stated. Whenever you ask a question, open your video and introduce yourself briefly with your name and organization that you're representing. And then ask a question by simply just raising a hand or writing the question in the chat box. Sorry, I was going too fast. The second reminder is that this consultation is about the Safeguards Policy Statements update as it relates to the accountability mechanism of the Asian Development Bank. So direct your questions, suggestions, comments, relating to the Safeguard Policy Statement update in relation to the accountability. We are here to mutually learn from each other. Mostly we are here to learn from you and input your suggestions, your comments into the upcoming update of the Safeguards Policy Statement. With that, I see there are plenty of participants today, especially from Mongolia and first time from several Pacific countries, which is a very, very welcome addition. So why not the first question from one of our Pacific participants? Anyone? To break the ice, I know the Pacific Islanders are brave. Been there many times and love every time I visited. You never shy away. So let's hear from you. Just to prompt you with some direction, based on the previous consultations that we had from our stakeholders from other countries. One question that was asked or discussed in these forums was relating to the on the safeguards and environmental risks. So the question was asked that what can ADB do better to assist the governments in identifying environment and social safeguard risks. The connected also question was that there are often seen gaps between ADB's safeguard policy and government's rules and regulations. So what can be done to bridge those gaps or to overcome those inconsistencies? So this was something which was asked and discussed several times in this forum before. Any question around this, or show me your hands if you would like to hear from our team on this area. Who's the brave soldier today? Bruce, would you want to comment on the first suggestion, directional point? Which hand? My colleague informs me that there is a hand. I cannot see, however. Who raised the hand? Oh, please go ahead. I'm sorry, my screen is not showing me. Sutari, please go ahead. Good to hear.
Hi, hi, Good morning and good afternoon, like for many people. My name is Sutari Wanasiri. I'm a consultant for the Accountability Councils. I am based in Thailand. And yeah, I actually would like to ask in terms of the consistency that you mentioned, the difference of the standard between what the ADB has put on as a safeguard and also the difference at the national, especially like legislation levels, like could that also be part of the requisite for the country or for the private sector that going to apply for the project or for the funding, like to meet that safeguard from the beginnings? Because like it's always much more difficult, like to try to fix it later, like after you apply for the project, right? So I'm just curious in terms of how this how you try to close this gap in practice. Yeah.
Thank you, Sathari, for being the brave soldier, as I call it, and being the first one to ask the question. Bruce, would you want to take this question? That how do you try to bridge the gap?
Iram and Sathari, thank you very much for the question. I was just having some connection troubles actually, and I didn't catch everything from Sathari. Apologies for that. Iram, would you mind just to paraphrase a little more for me? Thank you.
Sure. So Sathari basically asked the same question, that how do you try to bridge the gap between when there are inconsistencies between ADB safeguard policy and the national laws, regulations, especially when private sector is involved or if it's a non-sovereign even then. So the $1 million question.
Okay, great. That's a very good question. Thank you, Sathari. So firstly, to be clear, ADB as an international financial institution, we have our safeguard policy, which applies across all of the financing modalities that we support, and it applies across all of the countries that we operate in, whether we're doing sovereign lending with our developing member countries or with our private sector clients. Of course, countries across the region have their own legal frameworks, their own regulations. They might also vary at state or subnational level. So for every project, typically during the assessment process, we will identify what are the national legal requirements, and we'll have some dialogue with the government through the executing agency and sometimes with other line ministries that may be responsible for various different issues, such as involuntary resettlement, around where are there differences and how would those differences be addressed. And it is very important that that discussion occur early on in the process so that that can then be factored into the due diligence work and then the planning. For example, not all countries in the region would recognize informal settlers in terms of compensation. ADB's policy, of course, we recognize that they're not landholders, so they can't be compensated for the land, but they may have structures, they may have livelihoods on land, and we need to make sure through our policy that people are not worse off. So that's often a point of discussion, sometimes a point of contention, actually. So it's an area that we need to work through as part of the process. It's very critical because if those issues are not identified or not resolved satisfactorily through dialogue, then of course there may be issues missed, and then they could end up with compliance concerns at a later stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Sathari, I hope that your question is answered.
Yeah, thank you. Could I also follow up? Just a few more. I'm interested because in terms of like environmental safeguard, like for example, the pollution levels, I think like in many countries, like the the standard of the pollution level that are being recognized might be even much like lower than the international standard, for example, like in terms of the dust, in terms of the noise, in terms of the toxic chemical that is being used and being produced, like, and this is usually unwanted byproduct from the project, right? So, but when we try to also raise this issue, like we also found that the ADB tend to follow more of the national registration, that the standard is already low, and there's that's actually have more detrimental effects on the health of the people. And this is what we think is quite crucial, why we are going to follow that lower standard instead of following a much better standard level.
Thank you, Sutari. I can come and answer that one again. It's a very good question. So the ADB safeguard policy statement within the policy area for environment that covers pollution prevention and abatement does talk about standards, and ADB actually, based on that, does follow international standards. There's a primary reference, which is the World Bank Group Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, which itself includes further good industrial practice guidance, as well as reference to other guidelines, such as from the World Health Organization with their noise standards, with air quality standards. There's also a provision in the safeguard policy that whichever standard is more stringent should be applied. So in some cases, for example, when we have operations in the People's Republic of China, some of the air quality standards or water quality standards are more specific and more stringent than the ones that are included within those standard references. So then they would, of course, apply because they're required nationally. There is, however, consideration of some issues. For example, the WHO, with its air quality standards, does set guideline values and then also steps within air quality standards, recognizing that in some cases moving step by step to achieve higher standards is the only practical way for developing countries. In fact, sometimes the WHO most stringent standards are not even applied in some developed countries. So there is that recognition, but always the reference is those international standards, and the environmental assessment process will go through an assessment and then to look at the appropriate standards to be applied. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Sutari, does that answer your question? Do you have any other follow-up?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the answer. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, so excellent kickstart by Sutari. Any other question? I am still really looking forward to hearing from our Pacific participants, because it's an extreme pleasure to have you all on board. We have from Kiribati, a representative from the Ministry of Environment, Land and Agriculture. We have Solomon Islands Ministry of Mines and Energy representative. From Timor-Leste, we have a government representative. From NARO, we have NARO Utilities Corporation representative. And of course, from Fiji, we have the Roads Authority representative. We seldom hear from the Pacific countries, their perspectives, and you bring in very important perspective and a different angle as well. The development challenges in the Pacific Island states are much intense than other countries, and I think we can all benefit from your participation and from your suggestions, especially. In the meantime, Cambodia, Philippines, if I jump the region quickly, while we give some time to the Pacific representatives to think through. Philippines never fail us in asking a question. So my home country. I'm banking on you right now to break the ice. It's always tough to have the initial few questions, but then the consultations run very, very smoothly. So I really, before I just give my directional question or a point which is often considered, I really want to hear from you. Do let me know, colleagues, if I miss any hand here, because somehow I'm unable to see. Ministry of Economy and Finance, we have from Cambodia a couple of representatives from Ministry of Economy and Finance. Okay, in the meantime, Bruce, Warren, and Babette, if I can throw in a question that we have been hearing from government representatives as well as from CSO representatives quite often, is again, I would say $1 million question, that what are your views on some of the critical issues that lead to complaints by project affected people, and how can these issues be overcome? Any recommendations? I think I would request our respective chairs of both the mechanisms to come in on this one, that what are the usual critical issues that you have seen normally leading to complaints? Are they connected to safeguards? Warren, go ahead, please.
Well, I was gonna ask Babette if she wanted to go first.
Sure,
Okay, I think that as both Babette and I mentioned, and Bruce also mentioned, you know, the starting point is inadequate consultation, inadequate information. A lot of the complaints that we get from project affected people are from people who were not initially identified as project affected. And the reason for that is that during detailed design of a project, the alignment for linear infrastructure, for example, the alignments change. And so when these alignments change, then there is a different group of people affected by the project, or at least to a different extent than what was initially viewed. And so while there might have been a fairly careful analysis of project affected people during project preparation, sometimes during project implementation, there is a new group of project affected people. And if they are not adequately informed, consulted, then, you know, this comes as a surprise to them, and they're understandably not happy about it. So improving consultation throughout the entire project cycle is key. Second is that we often receive complaints from communities that have attempted to resolve their issues with the project authority, but it's not been satisfactory. It hasn't been successful. And often there's a very strong difference of opinion about what the impacts are on them between the project owner and the project affected people. For example, they may feel they haven't been provided enough compensation, whereas the authority that determines the compensation level believes they have accurately assessed the needed compensation. These are very sensitive issues, and if they can't come together and resolve them, they often get to a point where they don't trust each other. They don't talk to each other. And so by the time it comes to us, we really have a situation where the project affected people feel like they've been ignored. They feel like they've been left out of the process, and they feel like they've been mistreated, and they don't trust the project authority. So a lot of times what has to happen is to regain that trust. And that's really a matter of facilitating a dialogue between the two, understanding the issues better, and then trying to find a middle ground so that they can come together and reach an agreement. So I think that you know, each case is a little bit different that we receive. but I think that these are commonalities: consultation, communication, and better engagement during the process. So I guess that'd be my generalization on this, and I'm sure Babette can add to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. Yes, Babette.
Yeah, I completely agree with Warren, since I think fundamental, I mean, basic to all the complaints that we've received is really there's a lack of meaningful consultation. And as we said, based on the experience that we had, really two important things there. One is at the very beginning to really do a scan of the people who could be affected by the project, so that they are properly consulted and informed about the project. And probably this leads to something before that, which is that when projects are being conceptualized in a given area and people are being informed about the fact that there will be this new project, part of that information should already include the fact that if they should encounter problems, there is this accountability mechanism that they can resort to, so that they know that, first, that they have the project level grievance redress mechanism that will be put in place. They could also talk to ADB management. And lastly, they have this accountability mechanism. And that engagement should actually go throughout the entire process, so that we avoid things like what Warren mentioned, where if there are changes in alignment and additional new communities will be affected, or there could be certain communities which were to be affected before, which will no longer be affected now, both of those communities must actually be informed, not just informed, but engaged, so that there are also no undue expectations, like people, because you've consulted them, they expect certain compensations. And then when you start implementing the project and they hear about people receiving compensation and they're not getting anything and they haven't heard anything from the project, then, then this raises a lot of concerns, and this could raise actual complaints that can come to us. And that's why it's important that the implementers, the project implementers, fully understand the objectives and the principles of the safeguards policy of ADB, that meaningful consultation really has to happen all throughout the project cycle and has to be a continuing process back and forth. And as I mentioned, fundamental to that is that they have an understanding of what is required by the policy, and also that then the ADB management, if needed, provides the necessary capacity building, so they fully understand how it is to go about implementing the safeguards policy of the bank. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Babette. Bruce, do you want to come in, or?
Just briefly, I'd love to, of course, hear from colleagues from the regions with their perspectives, but I'll just add a couple of points. Warren and Babette have covered some very good points already regarding meaningful consultation and stakeholder engagement. And we do see that this is a critical area to focus on. We've in fact had a previous consultation on stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation, grievance redress mechanisms, and some of the colleagues may have joined that session as well. One of the issues that we've identified there with the existing policy, while it requires meaningful consultation, there's not much detail in terms of processes. And we've noticed that ADB doesn't specifically require for stakeholder engagement plans to be prepared. And we think that is something that would be extremely useful. Of course, you have to go through an identification process. And as Warren has said, that shouldn't be a one-off process because stakeholders may change. But getting a robust stakeholder engagement plan in place is important. And the preparation of that, of course, there's a range of things that we do need to consider. How do we consult in a culturally appropriate context? And of course, even within countries, we may have cultural diversity. There may be Indigenous people, ethnic minority groups. There may be some marginalized groups that are difficult to reach. could have people with disabilities. So, you know, range of issues around who are the stakeholders and their vulnerability and how do we access them and consult with them appropriately is very important. Gender, of course, is another aspect of that to consider, you know, who, when, and how, these types of issues. And I think that's an area where we can actually work a lot more in terms of preparing good practice guidance, supporting with capacity development, sharing experiences within our projects in a particular country or between countries, and try and stimulate that experience sharing across the region. Also, trust and safety. This is another one that both Warren and Babette have mentioned. The existing definition of meaningful consultation does talk about you know, consultations that are undertaken in an environment that is free of coercion and intimidation. Now that may not be an intention, but sometimes stakeholders may not feel comfortable to join consultations unless they're organized in an appropriate forum in an appropriate way. And if we're not consulting and drawing out their concerns, then issues may linger and they may come forward at a later stage. And that's not what we want to see. We want to be able to encourage good processes to address issues early for the benefit of the project so that the project can proceed on time, hit its development targets, and with affected people reaping those benefits. You know, it's certainly not our intention for things to need to move to the accountability mechanism in the long term. So, but I'll stop there. It'd be great to hear more from other colleagues during the session with, you know, what have been your experiences where these processes have worked or not worked? And we're very happy to hear different views on this. And we know sometimes there's sensitivities, and you know, it's okay to challenge us with some perspectives from your own experience as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. I was about to ask, especially participants in the room who have experienced dealing with complaints in their countries and seen pros and cons and have a lot of insights to offer. And if I may use my own experience of getting a cold call in the class while I was in school, if I may call upon Mr. Sitera from Cambodia. The Cambodia Railways case, we are almost all familiar with that. You were very, very active in that complaint, in that case. And I'm sure you have plenty of insights to share, you know, on areas that normally lead to complaints. One, the complaints have lodged, and whether the processes are working well, whether these two policies of the Asian Development Bank are providing relief and providing also enough for the government to handle complaints. Mr. Sitera, would you like to come in? We would, this audience would really like to, would really benefit from your insights. Apologies for taking your name and putting a spotlight on you, but I know that, and there you go. Thank you, sir. You're on a mute. If you can just unmute, yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Iron. I was not prepared, and I did not expect to be a speaker today, but rather a good listener. But I'm honored to be called and to join the discussion. And thank you, our colleagues from ADBs and from Pacifics and participants attending the session today. Yes, in case our friend from ADB or from other country doesn't know me, I'm from Cambodia and Ministry of Economy and Finance. We handle the land acquisition and settlement. And of course, Ms. Iron just highlighted that the experience we went through a decade ago really gave us a lot of the experience and insights in terms of the railway projects. I think it started in 2010 So now it's almost 12 years ago. A lot has been learned as well. I think, yes, since I joined the discussions, and I want to thank our speaker as well for the excellent presentations and very brief summaries of what is the problem solving process and requirements, and also the compliance reviews requirements. I think before I jump into experience in terms of consultation, I want to ask a question as well, or rather clarifications on the our speaker in terms of the lesson learned from the CRP that require the establishment of the comprehensive baseline data. Is this, are you referring to the country social economic holistic views, or if I catch wrong, or if I have my interpretation incorrectly? Please correct me if I understood it wrongly. Because in my view, the pre-project level social economic profile is available through the social economic surveys, and baseline data on pre-projects affected people's standard is therefore available. And so is that the baseline data on the country level that are we referring here to, and is it necessary to consider this country level baseline data? But if my interpretation or my understanding is incorrectly, please correct me. And the second point, I think, based on the experience of the ADB projects and along with our multilateral development partners over the years, I think Cambodia has done a lot of capacity building and institutional development. More recently in 2018, we were able to have our standard operating procedures on land acquisition and resettlement. And this standard operating procedure is reflections of and a combination of all these experience acquired over the years, and we're trying to meet the requirement of all our development partners, particularly ADBs and World Banks and others. So these standard operating procedures is a product that we are very keen, and currently we are committed to fully implementing this SOP. And in that, I think all tremendous and substantive requirements and procedures, and in terms of fulfilling the requirements of our development partners' policies, and particularly safeguard policies, is considered vastly in that. And also in that, there is a clear process and in terms of a grievance redress mechanism as well. And a lot of trainings and capacity building with relevant agency at the national level and the subnational level has been conducted. And every project's case, always a grievance redress mechanism is established. The trainings are conducted to all these relevant agencies and at each level. So I think all the national projects for public interest project is handled by our agency, but of course, lately I think we allow the public enterprise, particularly in energy sector, to implement resettlement LAR themselves. So I heard comments by our speakers during the presentation that there was remarks that there is a lack of capacity in terms of implementing resettlement, land acquisition and resettlement from the case of Sri Lanka and Cambodia. So with that, I'm not sure if it's maybe perhaps if you can clarify that, or perhaps it could be an agency that we, other than our Ministry of Economy and Finance, that might have done.
Yeah.
That need a capacity on that, I'm not sure. So these are the two remarks. Should I stop that? But I haven't response to the request by ERO on the consultation yet. But should I stop here first, or?
Yeah, I think that will be better, Mr. Secretariat. Let's answer your questions first, and I'm coming back to you on your comments because that's really helpful, going to be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Over to you, Vibet.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Setira, for raising those questions. And to clarify, when we're saying comprehensive baseline data, the socioeconomic data is specific to the socioeconomic data of the communities that are to be affected by the project. Of course, we need to situate the project when it's being design in terms of the socioeconomic conditions of the whole country. But at the level of the project, we're really looking at what's the socioeconomic conditions of the people. What are their sources of income, sources of livelihood? Where do they work? What are their skills? The level of indebtedness, for example, things like that, including the basic profile, which should include how many children go to school, which will also then really help design the relocation and the needs. What are the basic needs of the people in the relocation area that should be provided? The existing sources of water and electricity. It's actually all those little details so that there will then be a very good basis for identifying and planning the resettlement if people are to be resettled, which is what happened in this particular case in the Cambodia Railway. And in terms of sources of livelihood, this should include informal sources of livelihood of these people, so that, of course, that's where they get some income, and therefore it's important that there would be similar opportunities probably would have to be considered wherever it is that they are to be located. So it was this gap that was identified, and which were later on, of course, additional assessments were done, which filled in that gap, as you know, in the case of this particular Cambodia Railway project. In terms of capacity, the compliance review at that time found that there was inadequate capacity of the it's the multi-ministerial resettlement committee. Yes, and it was also acknowledged by the interministerial IRC that they needed capacity building, and they in fact raised, based on the interviews that were done by the CRP then, that they were disappointed with ADB because they thought that more assistance on this would be provided to them, because it was actually identified very early on. So this was as of that period in time. And of course, I don't know we don't know what has happened since then. But we did hear about some of the policy reforms that Cambodia has instituted, which included as inputs learnings precisely from this particular case. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Yes, if I may, thank you, Ms. Alicia. Yes, so thank you for the clarification. So basically you were reflecting the lesson learned, and at that point in time, and I think that has happened almost 12 years ago. And so basically a lot of reforms and a lot of, you know, the SOP that we have done, we have had recently is a lot of preventions and reflection and lesson learned that we makes a tremendous improvement and capacity building in that, and for better implementing and for better smooth projects implementation. So thank you for the clarification, and that was at the time that has happened. The second point, I couldn't agree more with you on the SES. So basically what we are doing, I think for every project now and then is all this data is currently collected in the SES, gathered at the pre-project level in the social economic surveys. And so we look at all these elements that you have highlighted to address this. So I couldn't agree more with you. Thank you for your explanations. I think if I want to join on the consultations, as Ms. Iram has requested, I rather would like to share the experience as well as the viewpoints also in terms of consultation. One point, it is clear that there should be a more and often consultations. I agree with our speakers that the more we talk, the more we consult, and the more information given to the relevant stakeholder, particularly affected people, and that problem would tremendously be resolved at some point. And the second point is that, yes, the clarity is in the at the stage where the detailed design is determined. That's the stage where we have the clarity and the affected people is. So that's is pointedly rightly pointed out. But my point here is that I think we should look at the process also of ADB process, business process. We should look at this as well, because in terms of my in my general comments, particularly, there is you know, we should look at the ADB business process as for a holistic look, especially on the project level, participation and consultation, as currently multiple consultation are required. For example, consultation to determine if there is support for projects, consultation during environmental assessment and planning, consultation on land acquisition planning, and separate consultation on gender basis, etc., so on and so forth. So all these are done separately and all at the project's preparation and processing stage. So this is an overburden, I think, for both the borrower as well as the affected people. Very confusing, I think, to some extent for stakeholders, and perhaps an insufficient way to undertake any meaningful consultation engagement. So therefore, as long as this is looked at in silos with each safeguard standard requiring a separate consultation, it will be very difficult to achieve the objective of a meaningful consultation. And in terms of LAR, land acquisition and resettlement, I think the lesson learned has missed a very critical factor on why there is usually widespread dissatisfaction by the affected people on the lack of meaningful consultation. This, I think, again, has to do with, if I may, perhaps the ADB business process in respect of the requirement of the draft resettlement plan before the loan approval. The first consultation, the census, and assessing the inventory of affected assets are all undertaken at the project's processing stage, and mostly by consultant recruited under the project preparation transactions TA. And the alignment is not known as the detailed engineering design are yet to be completed, and hence a corridor approach is taken. So with this, the problem is that we are not sure if all the people captured under the census will be affected by the project. And the second point is the consultation cannot be meaningful as we are unable to discuss the alignment and what will be the actual impacts. The affected people wants to know if their land or asset will be affected. And the next consultation is carried out once the detailed design are completed, based on which the actual land requirements are demarcated. There is a gap of at least 2 years between the first and the second consultation. So it takes 6 months from the first consultation for approval of the projects, and another 12 months from approval to recruitment of project consultant, and at least 6 months for the detailed designs is completed. So this gap, I think in my view, has disastrous impacts on the mental health of the affected people who were consulted during the first consultations. They remain in suspense all this time, not knowing if they are going to lose their land or other assets. And this is very unfair to the people. And it creates perhaps a trust deficit between the governments, and which is a moral hazard in our view. And additionally, I'm also concerned that we put a draft, particularly a draft resettlement plan, in the public domain when we are fully aware that the data is disclosed is not yet accurate representation of the land acquisition and resettlement impacts. And our speaker earlier highlight also that there are people who will be later not affected by the project and who will later be affected by the project but were not consulted at the early stage. So in this case, I think the SBS review should address this fundamental issues. And there can be no meaningful consultation and engagement with the affected people until the detailed design are ready. I think that's I stop it here. So I hope
Thank you, Mr. Sathira. As expected, excellent points raised, which are directly leading to the trust deficit, as you very well articulated, between ADB borrower and APs, and of course impacts the mental health of the affected people, as you again said. Bruce, I think tons of points for you to come in.
Yes, thank you, Erin. Thank you, Mr. Sathira. Very nice to see you again, and thank you for joining. And you're a little bit on the spot to us to respond, but you've shared some very important insights with us. On the issues of the baseline assessment and preparation of a draft resettlement plan, this is actually a very key issue. It's inefficient to prepare a full draft resettlement plan and with draft census studies when we don't yet know the final alignment. And this is an issue that we're looking at. There can be options actually to take more of a framework approach and then to have the full resettlement plan once the alignment has been confirmed. But I'd like to bring in my colleague Madhumita Gupta to speak a bit more on this, because this is an area that she and the team looking at the involuntary resettlement aspects have been looking at already, and she can respond more directly on some of those issues. But before doing so, I just mentioned a couple more cross-cutting issues. I think one of the key things here is looking at, who do you need to consult with and when appropriately in the project cycle, and on what types of issues. You've identified clearly some of the hazards and what that can do to someone, of course, from a mental health perspective or to their livelihoods. And I've seen this in the field where I've traveled to projects which have had a very long gestation period. For example, dam projects where they've been spoken about in a local community for maybe 5 or 10 years, and people are not sure when they're going to happen and who's going to be impacted. And they've made decisions about certain activities in their lives, or whether or not to plant trees and crops based on something that's unknown. And that does have an impact, as you've quite rightly pointed out. At the same time, though, if we're scoping possible alignments, and we look at technical feasibility, but then there's also social feasibility and social acceptability. And how do you undertake that, the early stage consultation with people around options? There might be, say, in a transport project, 5 different options for route alignments which are being considered. How do you engage appropriately with a wider community around that at an early stage to get views on that part of the decision making? And then later on, of course, once further decisions have been made about alignments, you need to consult in a different way. So, consultation perhaps has more of a nuanced process linked to the timing and the stage. And I think that's something we have to think about more carefully as to how to stage and plan these. It can be useful also, we often talk about meaningful consultation, but we're realizing a lot that communications and having communications experts also on hand to be able to sort of tailor these processes at the appropriate time can be useful. So that's a few broader perspectives, but let me ask Madhu to speak more specifically on the resettlement issues. And I think this will be relevant also for many other colleagues. Madhu?
Thank you, Bruce. And Mr. Sathira, these are extremely valid points that you raised. Confusion among, affected persons, that, they feel they were not consulted. Later on, their land or house was affected, the kind of stress and strain that they go through, and when these designs are not ready. So within our, when we are actually, we have a team which is working on involuntary resettlement. So we are also looking into this issue in terms of what is the advantage of having a draft resettlement plan when designs are so, changeable, when it changes during implementation. What are we gaining from it? So this is a discussion that we are having, with our operation colleagues, because as you know, the SPS, the revised SPS will also apply to all country context. Now, when we also did an assessment of the policy architecture, of the other MFIs when we did that comparative study. What they have also adopted a method of compliance over an agreed period of time, which means for each and every project, they assess the impacts and risks, and based on the level of risk, they decide what kind of due diligence, meaning the borrower and ADB would decide, okay, this is the level of due diligence we will do before appraisal. This is what we can actually push to implementation. So we are working on that. You know, we have different lending modalities. We are trying to look into all these details. I do agree that getting into a lot of details when designs are very preliminary might just be a duplication of effort during implementation. But while at the same time, for both borrower as well as ADB to understand what the impacts and what the probable risk would be, what kind of stakeholder engagement should take place, what type of communication, and what would be the detailed information or less detailed information that would be communicated to the affected persons at that stage before going to the board for approval, I think is important. And another point that you raised is that 2-year gap. Within ADB, we call this a black hole, actually. And a lot of things actually can happen during that period, and how, as you know, we can collaborate to actually speed up that, reduce that gap as much as possible, and keep in touch with the community, because the community also feels maybe the project will never happen. So they are, they are happy, they expand, their livelihoods, they might be building an additional room. So a lot of things happen during that period of time, and we see the costs also increase. So I think these are the important things that you mentioned. We also need to make some additional effort, obviously, in consultation with our borrowers. What can we do during that period that we can help each other, so that we are able to communicate better? As Bruce mentioned, who would be our stakeholders? What should we communicate? Should we focus more on that period of time doing capacity building for the agencies, the different agencies that work for land acquisition, the land department, sometimes the social securities department, sometimes the women's department. So there's a lot of interagency collaboration. So should we spend our time actually building that institution and the system? So there are a lot of options that we are exploring at the moment, but point taken, and we are also actually discussing these issues internally. So that's what I just wanted to tell you. And thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I would also like to take this opportunity to say that I have been to Cambodia and have been able to review the standard operating procedure. And I do see that after the Cambodia case, the country has taken it very seriously and have built its own procedures and legal systems to deal with multilateral agencies as well as resettlement. So there is an incremental progress, and I wish you all the best, and I'm sure you'll go more ahead and progress more on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. I hope, Mr. Sathira, some of your questions, comments are being addressed. But it's always a pleasure to hear from you, and you raise such valid points which are very helpful for us. Anything to follow up from your side before I move on to the next speaker?
Not really, just my appreciation for all the point taken, and Ms. Mahudima for highlighting the progress and the commitment, serious commitment and progress over the years in Cambodia. So excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again, Mr. Sathira, for coming when we called on you. Even if you come in like this without being prepared, then I wonder what will be the participation if you give you the time to prepare. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
May I now request Mr. Ranveer Lal from Fiji Roads, Head of Risk and Compliance. So you raised a point in the chat box. If you would want to come in and say it here and share it with everyone else, it will be very, very helpful for everyone to hear from you. Unless Yeah, there you go.
Hello, everyone. This is Rechika on behalf of Mr. Ravi Lal from Fiji Roads Authority. I suggested, I actually agreed with the suggestion of sharing experiences regionally, like for the Pacific Island countries, that we have risks and the mitigation strategies could be shared across, because one country may not be able to see that as a mitigation strategy while the others implement it. So once it is shared, people will have access and more ideas to broaden their mitigation strategies for the risks that we have noted, mainly concerning the environmental risks in the Pacific countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming in for Mr. Ranbir. Bruce, do you want to make a comment on this point, or?
So thank you very much. So the comment there was around sharing experiences across countries, I think within countries, and for the Pacific, of course, for the small island developing states in particular. This is a real challenge. We know that you have small numbers within the communities, and of course your ministries and government departments often have limitations in number of staff, and then you're geographically isolated both within your own countries and between countries. So the work around capacity support and developments is critical. I think there's a lot more that we can be doing there to support that approach. In fact, ADB's Pacific Department is in the process of developing its updated Pacific approach, including our approach for safeguards. And to support that, there is a technical assistance which the Pacific Department is keen to support on a number of these areas. In fact, in the coming weeks, we'll be having a separate consultation round on issues with small island developing states, and we will do some dedicated sessions for the Pacific. And then we're also linked to that, planning to do some sessions on fragility and conflict, because in those situations, of course, there are additional challenges, and undertaking our safeguards in conflict situations, or of course, where there's fragility and weak capacity or other governance challenges is another issue. So these we're certainly aware of and be coming to. It's a cross-cutting issue, though, I think, and we've heard this also from Mr. Sethra around the capacity work. And I would like to ensure that with our new policy rollout, that we take a more comprehensive approach to the capacity support across the board with training and then country programs. And then this can be something that we can continue with. And I do think when we brought in the policy in 2009, grievance redress mechanisms were new as in terms of a very clear policy requirement. And I'm not sure we did enough to really support the clients in the rollout of that. We are now doing a lot of work around lessons learned and evaluating grievance redress mechanisms, but it's an area where we're continuing to learn and need to support. If there's other thoughts, perspectives from the Pacific Islands side, we'd be very, very keen to hear on that. So please feel free to come back and have some more questions if you'd like.
Yeah, one last call for the Pacific Island participants. If you have anything to raise here, or later on, send us your comments, please, in writing. We are always waiting for constructive inputs, and these inputs are very helpful for us. That's the purpose of these consultations, but these consultations are not the only avenue available. You can reach us anytime with any kinds of comments. All right, then, I thank you all for your constructive participation, for listening to us patiently, for sending us your comments prior to this session in writing and raising them here. Once again, thank you to Mr. Sethra and all other participants who spoke, for breaking the ice by our Thailand participant, We have learned extremely from this session. Hope you have had the same experience. With this, I hand over the now the spot to my colleague Azim to take this session forward. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Iram. Thank you, Warren, Babette, Bruce, Madhu, as well as the entire EMT and those working behind the scenes, including Jennifer and Jelson and others. You all know who you are, but of course, a special and big thank you and a huge contribution, of course, to all of our participants and informants for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, and the very constructive feedback. And I'd like to reiterate that the comments that we've gathered here on this accountability mechanisms engagement that we received and hereafter will be considered in the final input into the updating of the policy statement. Please, please, please don't go yet. On your screen, please give us your feedback of how you think this particular consultation went and your inputs on what we can do to improve subsequent and future consultations. But for this consultation, please rate us and give us a score of 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest score, 5 being the highest score. So a score of 5 means you were highly satisfied with today's level of engagement and discourse and participation. And 1 means you were very dissatisfied with the level of engagement and satisfaction. So if you could do that now, we'd like to wrap up this poll question very, very quickly before turning it over to Director Bruce Dunn to provide his summary of what we've heard, as well as give us a glimpse of what we can look forward to in the remaining consultations up to maybe April of 2022. So we would like to hear from you. Please give us a rank of 1 to 5 again, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. There we have it. So 100% scored 4 or better. So 100% of you scored either a somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied. You're very kind, very generous with your scoring, and we thank you and appreciate that. But what would be even better is if you could give us an idea of how we can improve these engagements. We know that there's always room for improvement, and we want to know how specifically we can improve. Please let us know because we have further consultations coming up. We have a number of other consultations that we are going to be carrying out. This is the 10th one, as we'd said, but we have other ones forthcoming. And in order to improve those, we want to know specifically what we need to do. With that, let me turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn to summarize and to offer his glimpses on the way forward. Over to you, Bruce. Thank you very much, Azim. And thank you so much for everyone joining us today for this session. And, you know, I was pleased to see from the evaluation that it was useful for you. Perhaps in comparison to some of the sessions we've had, we maybe had more discourse from our side in terms of sharing perspectives. But the perspectives we've had and the questions have been no doubt very useful, and these will all contribute through each of these regional consultations to giving us a broader perspective on some of the issues and challenges that we face, and we'll of course need to translate this into a revised policy framework. And I think very importantly, there's a lot of work that does need to be done in addition to the policy in terms of providing further guidance to you know, you and our developing member countries, or to our private sector clients around how to implement the safeguards and how to you know, translate those frameworks into a national context based on your own legal framework. So there's a lot of work for us to do there. And the capacity support and rollout plan will need to be something we look at quite carefully and implement over quite a number of years. So that's, I think, one of the key lessons also from these issues with the accountability mechanism. Now, just to provide a brief summary of some of the issues that we did touch on today, we firstly had a number of clarifications.
For example, on how do we address the differences between national or country safeguard systems and ADB requirements. And I spoke a bit about how we do some benchmarking, we have dialogue at country levels, and we also clarified the international standards that we apply and what we do where there's differences, for example, around application of higher standards. We had, I think, a very good distillation of lessons learned from the accountability mechanism perspective, and they provided some case examples, but also generalized examples from experiences that they're seeing across multiple projects. Of course, some of the experiences relate to projects that were actually not implemented under the safeguard policy statement, but from earlier ADB policies for involuntary resettlement, Indigenous peoples, or our 2002 environment policy. But nonetheless, many of the general issues are still quite relevant. Things around ensuring good baseline studies, including the socioeconomic surveys, and we had some clarification also about what was meant by that. We talked about some of the challenges around when things change. So many of the projects are prepared based on feasibility studies prior to the detailed design. And when things change, of course, we need to also keep stakeholders updated of those. And that really brought us into a discussion around strengthening stakeholder engagement and meaningful consultation. Needs to be in stages, of course, needs to be timely, and it needs to be adapted. So as we get more information about who's going to be impacted by a project, then obviously the consultation processes need to take that into consideration. But we also had some very good and useful points that were raised also about ADB requirements in the business process, and the timing of things like land acquisition and resettlement plans. They push at the moment for certain information to be presented when it's not yet ready, before detailed design, and where you don't yet know who will be impacted by the project. So this is something that we need to consider in terms of our requirements. Is it appropriate that we could go to a more of a framework approach at the appraisal stage, and then allow for the full land acquisition and resettlement plans to be prepared? But of course, then the consultation processes would need to adapt to that process as well. So they were extremely useful to try and think through some of those issues. Another critical issue that we talked about was the grievance redress mechanisms, and the team from the accountability mechanism presented on some of their experiences and recommendations there. We didn't talk so much about some of the country experiences there, but it was mentioned, for example, in Cambodia, that they've been doing work around ensuring grievance redress mechanisms are applied in all of the projects, and supporting training and capacity building for those. And it was also an area where we clearly have recommendations for support from ADB to continue with that capacity development. Then finally, we had some comments also from the Pacific context, where the need for sharing experiences across the Pacific or small island developing states is also a fairly acute issue as part of that capacity building program. So we touched on quite a lot of issues, and this complemented quite well the other sessions that we've run. In fact, on this topic, we've done sessions for our developing member countries in different regions, and we've also done sessions with civil society. So across the 5 consultations that we've done, I think we've had quite a range of important and useful recommendations. So we will be bringing that together in terms of a summary, and we'll be feeding this back into the policy development. I'd also like to note that for these regional consultations, we have a number of other topics still to cover, quite a few cross-cutting issues that we'll be addressing between now and May. An important one coming up is on integrated environmental and social assessment. So it's a very important piece of the policy framework that we need to get right. So we'll be doing a consultation on that one. We've also got cross-cutting issues, as I mentioned, around fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. We'll be doing some consultations on a range of gender issues and how to address potential risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We'll also have sessions on country safeguard systems, which I think will be of great interest to you and where you'll have recommendations. Climate change. In fact, climate change, we were scheduled to have a session on that next week, but we're going to delay that slightly as we've been continuing to do some work on the analytical study. And instead of disclosing a paper just at the very last minute, we will reschedule that session most likely for April. So please do stay tuned for the website, and we'll also be sending out information updates to you in case anything changes. So that's the consultation approach. We're also planning to reach out to a number of our countries for follow-up bilateral consultations, which will be occurring through the middle of this year. So still, quite a lot of engagement that we're hoping to have with you as we move towards the preparation of the actual paper. So thank you again for joining today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in future sessions. And until then, please take care and stay safe. Thank you.